Today is August 28th. It's the 241st day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. On this day in 1917, a group of suffragettes picket outside the White House in Washington, D.C. President Woodrow Wilson has endured daily picketing outside his front gate for the last 8 months. The women protesters come from all over the country to demand his support of an amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. The Anthony Amendment was first introduced in Congress by Susan B. Anthony 40 years earlier and was defeated by a 2-to-1 vote margin. Decades later, American women are growing impatient. Wilson, despite having taught at a women's college and being the father of 2 self-declared suffragettes, is not a strong supporter of the women's suffrage movement. The National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, decides to pressure the president. The National Women's Party begins a months-long protest. From January through August, the suffragettes protest peacefully. They hold signs asking, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" And "How long must women wait for liberty?" Wilson maintains his decorum. When passing through the White House gates, he greets the suffragettes politely, but does not respond to or acknowledge their demands. On this day in 1917, the women changed their tactics. Protesting on this day begins peacefully. The suffragettes hold their signs, bystanders take notice, and start to get angry. Mixed in with their usual signs promoting suffrage are anti-war slogans. The United States has recently entered World War I in April of that year, and as with any war, some are for it and others are not. The pro-war bystanders grow increasingly angry at such provocation, and soon they clash with the suffragettes. Police break up the skirmish and arrest 10 suffragettes. They are given fines, but refuse to pay. So the suffragettes are thrown in jail for 3 days. Many women picketers are repeatedly jailed between June and November of 1917. But after this day, the sentences become harsh, and some are held for up to 60 days in deplorable conditions, and they experience torturous and abusive treatment. In protest, the suffragettes go on hunger strikes. Prison doctors resort to holding them down and force-feeding them. Meanwhile, outside the White House, women continue to gather, keeping the pressure on the president. By January 1918, Wilson has grown appalled over the situation. More importantly, he's greatly concerned about the negative publicity generated against his administration. After the arrest of the 10 suffragettes on this day in 1917 and subsequent arrests, a more motivated Wilson finally lends his support for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. It will be 2 more years before the amendment is ratified. The 1968 Democratic National Convention is held in Chicago, Illinois at the end of August. At the beginning of August 1968, the Republicans nominate Richard Nixon as their candidate for the U.S. presidential election that year, nominating Spiro Agnew as his running mate. And now it is the Democrats' turn to nominate their candidate. President Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, has only served 1 full term as president. Before that, he serves the remainder of President Kennedy's term after Kennedy is assassinated. And since Johnson serves less than half of Kennedy's term, he is constitutionally eligible to run for a 2nd full term in 1968. But by 1968, the Democratic Party is fractured, and Johnson no longer has the power that he once had over the party. On top of that, he sees no way to win the war in Vietnam. And his health is pretty poor. It's not made public at the time, but Johnson is concerned that he may not live to see the end of his second term. At the end of March 1968, President Johnson announces that he will not run for re-election. The next day, his approval ratings skyrocket. So the Democrats go into their party convention at the end of August with no clear party leader and amidst the chaos and turmoil of the year that is 1968. Just 2 months earlier, in June, presidential candidate Robert Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles. And 2 months before that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis. And all spring and summer there have been protests against the Vietnam War and race riots in major metropolitan areas. New York, D.C., Detroit, Louisville, Baltimore. And that's just 1968, not to mention 1967, 66, 65. Protesters descend on Chicago intent on disrupting the convention. 3 main groups take to the streets. The National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. Their beef is obvious. The Youth International Party, they call themselves Yippies. Their aim is to celebrate the counterculture and protest against the state of the nation. They nominate their own candidate, Pegasus, a live pig that they bring out to their protests. And Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, who are all about resistance. These groups have come to Chicago to challenge the Democratic Party leadership to break from the past and embrace change, to reform the country's political system that they believe is corrupt and rigged to benefit insiders. They've been planning their convention disruption campaigns for the past year, and the leadership of the city of Chicago has been planning as well. Mayor Richard Daley has the Chicago Police Department on standby, and in addition, he's arranged to have the support of the Illinois National Guard. The Chicago police are a visible presence during the convention with their billy clubs and their powder blue helmets. The tension that's been building throughout the year, the unrest, the upheaval, the riots, the assassinations, comes to a boil in the first few days both inside the convention hall and outside the DNC. On this day in 1968, it all boils over when more than 10,000 protesters gather in Grant Park inside the Loop in downtown Chicago. They are met by 23,000 police and National Guardsmen. One of the 10,000 protesters pulls down the American flag that's flying in the park. The police move in and beat him mercilessly. The protesters bombard the police with whatever they can get their hands on: rocks, signs, food. They know that the next step for the cops will be tear gas. So the crowd moves into the streets, forcing the police to gas the whole city. It's a full-scale riot by the time the protesters exit the park. A large group of them head towards the Hilton Hotel, and by nightfall, protesters and police clash outside the Hilton. Tear gas is sprayed all around, so much so that the soon-to-be nominee Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, is affected by the gas while he's taking a shower upstairs in the hotel. The police violently assault the protesters outside the Hilton, and it's all broadcast live on national TV. The protesters chanting, "The whole world is watching." The violence outside the Democratic National Convention on this day in 1968 is ugly, and unlike anything seen before or since. So much so that you would think the nation would be appalled by the actions of Mayor Daley and the Chicago police. But in the weeks that follow, Mayor Daley receives an overwhelming amount of letters of support from people all across the country. And a Gallup poll finds that the majority of Americans approve of how the Chicago police handled the protesters. After riots break out outside the Democratic National Convention on this day in 1968, Richard Nixon takes a significant lead in the polls over Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey, a lead that carries him all the way to the White House. And in the next local election, Mayor Daley is re-elected in a landslide. There are 125 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. Today's episode was co-written by my sister Elizabeth Schultz. So many thanks to Eliz. She'll be contributing more compelling words in a couple of days, so stay tuned for that. And if you're still listening, better butter your Q finger up. Talk to you tomorrow.